The sun was barely rising over the wide stretch of open farmland when Daniel Harper steered his dusty pickup truck down a narrow gravel road that seemed to disappear into the horizon. He had spent most of his life around horses. Born into a ranching family, he understood animals better than he understood people. That morning, he was heading to a property he had never visited before, responding to an online listing for a prize quarter horse being sold at what seemed like a surprisingly low price. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who ignored a good opportunity, but he was cautious. Deals that looked too perfect usually carried hidden flaws. Still, the seller's voice on the phone had sounded convincing, calm, polite, almost eager. The ranch was said to be closing due to financial trouble, and the owner claimed he needed to sell quickly. As Daniel's truck rolled to a stop in front of a faded red barn, he felt an odd stillness in the air. The property looked neglected. Fences sagged. Weeds crept through what once might have been a tidy yard. The house nearby had curtains drawn tight despite the brightening morning. A tall, wiry man stepped out of the barn as Daniel climbed down from his truck. His name, according to the listing, was Earl Whitmore. Earl's handshake was firm but cold. His eyes avoided direct contact. "You here for the horse?" Earl asked. "That's right," Daniel replied. "You said he's in the main stall?" Earl nodded and motioned toward the barn. "Best horse I ever owned. Just need the cash." As they walked inside, Daniel noticed the barn smelled stronger than usual. Less like hay and animals, more like damp wood and something metallic he couldn't quite identify. The stalls lined both sides of a narrow aisle. Most of them were empty. At the far end stood a powerful bay quarter horse, its coat glossy even in the dim light filtering through dusty windows. The horse lifted its head as they approached, ears twitching. Daniel felt a small wave of relief. The animal looked healthy, well-fed, and alert. He stepped closer, extending a hand gently. The horse snorted softly and allowed the contact. "He's in good shape," Daniel said. "Doesn't look like a ranch shutting down." Earl shrugged. "I take care of what's valuable." Something about that answer unsettled Daniel. He walked around the stall, checking the hooves, the tack, the feed bucket. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal compared to the rest of the property. As he crouched to examine the horse's front leg, he heard it. A faint sound. A soft, muffled thud. Daniel paused, listening carefully. The barn was otherwise silent. "Did you hear that?" he asked casually. "Hear what?" Earl responded too quickly. Daniel stood and glanced toward the neighboring stall. It was closed off with rough wooden boards instead of the usual metal gate. Unlike the others, this stall had no nameplate, no feed bucket visible from the aisle. He stepped closer. Another sound came, this time unmistakable. A weak, strained whisper. "Help!" Daniel froze. He turned slowly toward Earl, whose face had gone pale beneath the dim light. "What's in that stall?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but firm. "Nothing. Old storage," Earl replied, shifting his weight. The whisper came again, barely audible but urgent. "Please." Without waiting for permission, Daniel moved to the boarded stall. He pulled at one of the planks. It didn't budge. The boards had been nailed tightly from the outside. "Open it," Daniel demanded. Earl took a step back. "You don't want to get involved in things you don't understand." That was all Daniel needed to hear. He grabbed a loose metal tool hanging from a nearby hook and wedged it under the plank, prying with force. The wood cracked and splintered. Earl suddenly lunged forward, but Daniel shoved him back with enough strength to send him stumbling into a pile of hay. Another plank broke away, and then Daniel saw her. A woman, bound at the wrists and ankles with coarse rope, slumped against the far wall of the stall. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt and tears. A strip of cloth lay on the ground beside her, likely what had been used to gag her. Her eyes met his. They were filled with fear and hope. Daniel's heart pounded as he tore away the remaining boards. He rushed inside and knelt beside her. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Her voice trembled. He said no one would come. Behind him, he heard the shuffle of boots. Earl was attempting to flee. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services while keeping one eye on Earl. "There's a woman being held captive," he said clearly. "Send police immediately." Earl bolted toward the barn doors, but the sound of sirens was already approaching in the distance. Whether someone else had reported suspicions or pure coincidence had intervened, Daniel didn't know, but the timing was perfect. Within minutes, Police vehicles surrounded the property. Earl was arrested on the spot. Paramedics carefully lifted the woman onto a stretcher. Her name, Daniel would later learn, was Clara Jensen. She had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier from a neighboring county. She had answered a job listing for ranch work. Instead, she had been overpowered, restrained, and hidden away in the very stall meant for livestock. As authorities began their investigation, more disturbing details emerged. Clara wasn't Earl's first victim. Evidence found inside the farmhouse suggested a pattern: manipulative job ads, isolated interviews, and threats designed to keep victims silent. Daniel stood outside the barn, shaken but steady. He hadn't come looking for trouble. He had come to buy a horse. Instead, he had saved a life. In the days that followed, the story spread rapidly across local news outlets. The headline practically wrote itself: Rancher discovers missing woman hidden in barn while purchasing horse. Daniel avoided the spotlight at first. He didn't consider himself a hero. He insisted he had simply followed his instincts. But Clara told a different story. During a press interview weeks later, now recovering and surrounded by family, Clara spoke about the moment she heard Daniel's voice in the barn aisle. "I had almost lost hope," she said quietly. "He wasn't supposed to check that stall. No one ever did. But he heard me." Her voice broke. He didn't ignore it. Those words resonated deeply. Because how often do people ignore the faint sounds of trouble around them? How often do we convince ourselves that something is none of our business? Daniel admitted later that it would have been easier to dismiss the noise. It could have been an animal. It could have been wind against the boards. He could have shrugged and focused only on the horse. But something told him to look closer. That instinct changed everything. The investigation uncovered that Earl had relied heavily on isolation. The property's remote location ensured few visitors. Deliveries were infrequent. Neighbors were distant and uninvolved. The barn had become a prison hidden in plain sight. Experts who later analyzed the case pointed out something crucial. Many crimes persist not because they are invisible, but because they are overlooked. Clara had tried to make noise whenever she heard movement outside the stall. Most days, there was nothing. Some days, Earl drowned out any sound with machinery. But on that morning, fate, or perhaps something greater, placed Daniel exactly where he needed to be. Months later, Daniel received a letter in the mail. It was from Clara. She wrote about rebuilding her life, about therapy sessions, and reconnecting with her family. She described small victories: sleeping through the night, stepping outside without fear, hearing barn doors close without panic. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "You didn't just open that stall. You opened the door back to my life." Daniel kept that letter folded in his wallet. He still ran his ranch. He still bought and sold horses. But he noticed he paid closer attention now. To people, to silences, to subtle signs that something might not be right. The horse he had come to buy was taken into protective custody during the investigation. Eventually, authorities allowed Daniel to adopt him. It felt symbolic somehow, rescuing the animal from a place that had hidden such darkness. He named the horse Valor. When asked during a community event what lesson he hoped others would take from his experience, Daniel answered simply, "Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And don't walk away from a whisper." The story serves as a reminder that evil often hides behind ordinary appearances. A barn can look like any other barn. A handshake can seem polite. A deal can appear harmless. But vigilance matters. Compassion matters. Courage, especially the quiet kind, matters most of all. Clara eventually chose to work with advocacy groups supporting victims of abduction and trafficking. She shared her experience not to relive the trauma, but to empower others. She emphasized the importance of community awareness and reporting suspicious activity. "Someone paying attention saved me," she would say during speaking engagements. Be that someone. The rural community where the barn once stood changed after that day. Neighbors spoke more often. Local law enforcement organized safety workshops. Ranchers checked in on one another. All because one man refused to ignore a faint cry behind a wooden wall. Sometimes heroism doesn't come with dramatic music or flashing lights. Sometimes it looks like a rancher in dusty boots prying loose a board because something doesn't sit right in his gut. Sometimes it starts with listening. The barn has since been torn down. The property sold. New fences stand where old ones sagged. The air no longer carries the weight of secrets. But the story remains. A rancher came to buy a horse. And instead, He found a bound woman hidden in a stall. He could have turned away. He didn't. And because of that choice, a life was restored, a criminal was stopped, and a quiet rural morning became a testament to the power of paying attention. In a world where it's easy to stay focused on our own transactions, our own schedules, our own goals, this story challenges us to pause when something feels wrong, to look beyond what we came for, to recognize that sometimes the real reason we're somewhere has nothing to do with the reason we think we're there. Daniel still says he believes in fate, but he also believes in responsibility, because fate may put you in the right place. It's your courage that decides what happens next.